All right, good morning and welcome to the webinar. We appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us. Before we get started, I just want to cover a few housekeeping items. This webinar is produced by the Underserved Victim Populations Training Project, a project of the Center for Innovation and Resources. Funding for this project comes from the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, Cal-OES, Victim Services Branch, with funding made possible through the United States Department of Justice Victims of Crime Act. For those of you who can hear me, this might seem obvious, but I just want to remind everyone to turn on their speakers in order to hear the presentation. Use the Q&A feature to ask the presenter any questions that you may have. We will leave time at the end of the presentation for Dr. Rogers to answer questions. The chat panel is where you can ask tech support questions. We will answer questions immediately in the chat panel. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter. Gimel Rogers is a licensed psychologist with over 10 years of professional speaking and training experience. She is currently the training director of the Professional, Clinical, and Forensic Services Department at the Institute on Violence, Abuse, and Trauma. She earned her doctorate from Pepperdine University and has provided trauma-focused care with clients from Children of the Night program and the Ventura Youth Correctional Facility, FCI Terminal Island, and community programs serving survivors of intimate partner violence. Dr. Rogers presently works with survivors who are recovering from emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. Having published in the areas of culture, coping, spirituality, and trauma, she is an adjunct professor at Pepperdine University and Point Loma Nazarene University. She also dedicates time and energy to individuals across the world through her organization, Fearless Individuals Resistant to Entrapment, and its brand, One Temple Fitness. Now, please bear with me for a moment while I switch controls over to Dr. Rogers.
Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing this morning? I hope everyone is well. Just to highlight, thank you so much for introducing me. I am actually the owner of Fire Igniting Lives, which is my private practice in which this presentation webinar is coming out of. And so today we will be talking about defining healthy relationships, intimate partner violence in adolescents, and toxic ideas about masculinity. So I really encourage you all to write down any questions that you may have or any clarifications that you may have regarding this topic. And if we run out of time, you are most welcome to contact me, and my information will be at the end of this presentation. So today we're going to start off with just an overview of intimate partner violence. I'm going to highlight what that looks like in general, as well as talk about intimate partner violence in adolescence, and so some of the differences, masculinity and the effects of trauma, and then what actually healthy relationships look like. So, what is intimate partner violence, formerly known as domestic violence? Domestic violence, or IPV, is a pattern of abusive behavior in which a person uses coercion, deception, harassment, humiliation, manipulation, and/or force in order to establish and maintain power and control over an intimate partner or former intimate partner. And that's something that I really want to highlight for this particular presentation as we're talking about adolescents in particular, because a lot of times if a couple breaks up, an adolescent couple breaks up, but they attend the same high school, middle school, and yes, this unfortunately happens even at the elementary school level, then you actually start to see how the person can use the deception and harassment and the humiliation and the manipulation, but it manifests differently. It manifests more so in a manner of bullying. And so I want you to kind of keep that in your mind, that when we're talking about intimate partner violence or DV with adolescents, that sometimes we may attribute it to bullying because they're either no longer together. And so we want to just kind of keep that in the forefront of our mind. So some language for the discourse. First, I'd like to really distinguish between abuse and aggression. And so when looking at these two terms. Abuse is a pattern of behavior where one partner gets his or her needs met at the expense of the other through the use of power and control. And so, usually, again, this has elements of intimidation and it often produces trauma. Versus aggression, on the other hand, it's usually physical, but aggression can also be verbal or sexual. And it's where one person commits an assaultive behavior on the other person. Now, this last bullet point, it speaks to that you can have abuse without physical aggression or aggression without abuse. So, what this means is that if you look at various sports, right, whether it's ice hockey or regular hockey, football, um, even baseball, jujitsu, any type of sport, particularly contact sports, then you see that people have this manifestation of aggression. However, the aggression isn't always to hurt the person or because they're angry or you physically assault them from a place of malice intent. And so that's what you really also want to look at is the intention behind it. And so aggression in the sense of understanding that mutual abuse would be where both partners are fighting with each other for power and control. However, it's not common. And while abuse and aggression can occur, you can have aggression without abuse. Okay. So I just want to emphasize that and use the example as sports to understand how aggression can be present without abuse. But typically, when abuse is present, aggression is also present. Okay. Next, I want to highlight other terminology that you should be familiar with, such as battering. Battering is repeated physical abuse, coercion, first forcing a person to do something against his or her will, and then control, having emotional or physical power over someone. And then cycle of violence. And we're going to talk more about the cycle of violence. And so pattern of DV consisting of three phases: the tension building, the acute battering incident, the calm, loving, apologetic, it will never happen again phase. Now, I always say that honestly, when we're looking at relationships, most of the time it starts off with the calm, the loving. When a relationship starts off as the tension building or the acute battering, most people don't necessarily stay in that. And so when you're looking at the start of the relationship, it usually starts with that person being charming, sometimes manipulative, and very loving and affectionate to draw that person in. And then, depending on the relationship, because every relationship is different, then you can see the tension building and then the acute battering. And the acute battering, although we're talking about and defining battering as the repeated physical abuse, battering can also come in the form of emotional and psychological abuse as well. And so understanding that it doesn't always have to be somebody physically hitting you. And so while the typical cycle of violence, when you look at it, it talks about acute battering. But if you look at it in the context of emotional or psychological abuse as well. So some more terminology that I would like to go over: denial. So refusal to admit thoughts or behaviors to oneself or to others. And so you see denial for the victim as well as the perpetrator. In the regard of on the perpetrator side, that either they gaslight and say, oh, you're just believing that I said that, I really didn't say that, or you're thinking too much into it more than what it is, or no, I never did that, you're going crazy, somebody else did that, or it's all on you. So that's denial from the perpetrator standpoint. You can also have denial from the victim standpoint, indicating that no, he didn't do that, or she didn't mean to do that, or it will never happen again. And so denial can happen on both accounts and from both parties. Escalation. Escalation is an increase in either threats or level of violence. When you're looking at this escalating behaviors, you're looking at it from the standpoint of seeing how it continues to elevate over time. So, looking at the escalation, it's similar to what I was saying on the previous slide, that it doesn't start with the I'm going to beat you the first time that I meet with you, or I'm going to berate you, or minimize who you are, or play on your emotions. Sometimes that happens, and if the red flags are there in the beginning, obviously run, but most of the time it doesn't start that way. And so wanting to make sure that we educate our adolescents and the people who we service with recognizing the minor details and the minor escalation and threats or in the level of violence. So it may start off with, I hold your hand and your friend is coming up, but I don't want you to go run down the hallway and leave me at the locker. And so I squeeze your hand a little tight. And one person may just kind of look at the other person like, hey, like, why'd you squeeze my hand? Or that kind of hurt. So just even recognizing those minor details or minor actions or behaviors that that person might engage in, or saying like, oh, you don't need to take that person's phone call, or you always hang out with them, or you need to stop hanging out with them. If you don't stop hanging out with them, like, I'm going to break up with you. So really just recognizing even the smallest escalation and increase in the behavior. And then intimate, so emotional or physical relationship, usually involving affectionate, romantic, or passionate feelings. And so while we are talking about intimate partner violence and more of the romantic relationship side, I want to highlight that this can also happen in friendships, platonic relationships, as well as in family relationships. But for the purpose of this discourse, understanding that when we're talking about intimate, it doesn't always have to be something sexual or physical, it can also be emotional. And then intimidation, so the act of making others do what one wants through fear. So, some causes. Domestic violence, or IPV, is caused by the conscious decision and willful choice of the perpetrators to use abusive tactics. The violator's goal is to get what they want and when they want it. The problem is not caused by alcohol or other drugs, or by children, or job stress, or psychological illness, or pets, or Satan, or especially the violated woman or man. And so I really want to highlight this because sometimes we make excuses for other people's behaviors. Now, there is a difference between understanding the problem or understanding the behavior and the genesis or the beginning or where it manifests from, and making an excuse for it. So, for example, if you know that the adolescent witnessed domestic violence or IPV between their parents, or you know that the adolescent lives in a single parent home, but their older sibling is constantly harassing, bullying, or beating them up, and then they engage in this relationship. Social learning theory tells us that we learn from our environment. And because that's more of the nurturing piece, by learning from our environment, this is where they can be picking up the behaviors from, saying, hey, my mom talks to my dad like that, or my dad talks to my stepmom like this. Therefore, this must be okay of how to show love. And so we have to redefine how you show affection, how you're intimate with that person, and how you love that person, because sometimes this is all that people know. And so it's really key to make sure that when we're talking about the causes, that while we can understand where the person learned the behavior, while we can understand how they came to that acting out behavior, it does not mean that it is the victim's fault or that it is the survivor's fault. So, various dynamics of IPV. Anyone can be a victim. There is no typical victim. Victims literally come from all walks of life, age groups, as I mentioned in the very beginning, that even you see it in elementary school. But most of the time, when it's that young, sometimes we have a tendency to dismiss it as either they're roughhousing or they're just being petty or it's a bullying situation. And I really want to underscore this, particularly for the younger children, because bullying is different than experiencing intimate partner violence beginning at 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, because they both affect your self-esteem. They both can affect how you trust individuals and how you bring individuals in your life and how you relate to people. However, with bullying, you feel a sense of maybe somebody can help me by going to my teachers, by telling my friends, by possibly telling my parents. When it's somebody that you like, particularly when you're that young, you're a little bit more hesitant because you like that person and you want to feel accepted by that person. And so, therefore, you may be less hesitant to go tell a friend or a family member. Or if you do, you may joke around and say, so and so speaks to me this way, but I just tell them to shut up. It's not that big of a deal. Or, yeah, I was running and I said something that he didn't like and he pushed me. Or she always likes to call me stupid and yell at me in front of her friends, but it's okay because I just yelled back. And so you see this in adolescents and adults as well. However, really just want to drive home the point of when working with individuals who are in elementary and middle school, that there's a difference between one who might be experiencing bullying and who might be experiencing IPV. Another point to that, which makes it a little bit more fuzzy or complicated to point out, is that when you're that young, although times have changed, more often than not, parents still do not want their children, quote unquote, having a significant other or a boyfriend or a girlfriend or dating somebody that young. And so they're less likely to disclose that they're even in a relationship. And so I just kind of want you to keep that in your mind as we're talking about this topic, particularly for the younger children. And to the last bullet point, in relationships where DV exists, violence is not equal. Even if the victim fights back or instigates violence in effort to diffuse a situation, there's always one person who is the primary, constant source of power, control, and abuse in the relationship. So, some IPV red flags and warning signs: extreme jealousy, possessiveness, unpredictability, a bad temper, or somebody who is easily triggered or they cannot regulate their emotions, cruelty to animals, that is definitely a sign, verbal abuse, extreme controlling behaviors, antiquated beliefs about roles of women and men in relationships, their control of all finances, forced sex or disregard of their partner's unwillingness to have sex. And even in this particular category, as it relates to the second one, the sabotage of birth control methods or refusal to honor agreed upon methods. And you see this from both men and women, blaming the victim for anything bad that happens, and then sabotage or obstruction of the victim's ability to work or attend school can be a victim. There is no typical victim, as I mentioned before. Also, I have seen where individuals have met in an after school program or in a counseling group, and one person feels that they can no longer participate in that dance program or the theater program or the counseling group because of their ex significant other or their significant other becoming jealous of another person in the group. So just being mindful of that as well and how that can manifest. Also, abuse of other family members, children, or pets. accusations of victim flirting with others, having an affair, cheating, control of what the victim wears and how they act, and then sabotage of obstruction of victim's ability to work or attend school. You'll notice on the other side, the lighter gray, the abuser's control of all finances. And so I know we're talking about adolescents, but even in this day and age, parents give adolescents money to, let's say, go to Starbucks after school, or to have lunch. And I've heard of cases where one partner would say, like, oh, you don't need to eat lunch today. Like, let's go to the mall and buy me something after. Or you don't need to have lunch today. Let me get that money so I can get this new video game that I've been saving for. And so, although it's not as common in the adolescent population, you still see the control of one's finances come up, but it just comes up differently. And typically, the victim survivor will make the excuse of, oh, I wasn't that hungry anyways. And plus, like, I know they really wanted that video game, or, oh, it'll be fun for us to go to the mall together and pick something out. And so just also looking at it from that aspect as well. Demeaning the victim either privately or publicly, and that goes hand in hand with the accusations of the victim flirting with others and trying to control the victim and really speaking down and negative to the victim. And then the next two bullet points would go under more of the realm of emotional abuse. And so I just want to briefly define, and it will be coming up on the next slide, about the emotional abuse, which is the overarching umbrella. And underneath emotional abuse, you have verbal abuse and psychological abuse. Okay. And so you have the category of emotional abuse, and then underneath that, you have verbal abuse and psychological abuse. And so underneath the broad category of emotional abuse, there's embarrassment or humiliation of the victim in front of others, and then harassment of the victim at work. So some tactics used by batterers containing red flags. So again, physical, we know that is more so hitting, punching, slapping, strangulation, spitting on victim survivor, use of weapons, sexual, pressured or coerced sex, forced sex, sexual practices. Again, underneath this would be the birth control, trying to control birth control, etc. Psychological threats of violence against victims, self or others, acts of violence against self or people other than the victim. And so, for example, if two adolescents are in high school and one adolescent has a younger sibling, and that the perpetrator hurting the younger sibling in front of their partner. Isolation of victim, and then again, use of children, threats to take them away, or even threats of deportation. I have seen that a lot lately, even in the high school environment. And we know that teenagers do have children. And so I've seen where there have been a combination of one family is actually born and raised and legal to the country, and the other family is not. And so the one partner would threaten to take the child away from the other partner and say that they will deport the individual's parents. And so that usually happens. I've seen this on a couple occasions with seniors in high school. I've also seen this more rampant in continuing schools, continuing education schools, and the TAY population as well, the TAY transitional age youth population as well. And then economic, we talked about that as well. And more often than not, you'll see with the young adults, the maintaining a bank account or line of credit, or trying to prevent them from obtaining one. So this video, I want to say that there is a trigger warning involved in this video. And so I want to, for you to take a look at it and just jot down any reflections that you may have about it.
In a nice neighborhood in upstate New York, in a nice house like the ones you know, behind closed doors, a father commands his 13-year-old son to pick up a camera and start recording.
Look at me, bitch. You play those stupid games with me, I'll knock your teeth out of your face.
The father delivers a verbal flogging to the mother in front of their children.
You act like a in front of the kids.
It will go on for nearly an hour.
You little slut. If I see a dog trim your ass up, I won't stop. I won't stop.
It is domestic abuse, the kind we hear about but often don't believe.
I don't want to see a stupid ass cook itself. Stupid ass helper.
Susan is 42 years old. They have 3 children. The father, Ulner, directs his 13-year-old son, the cameraman, to get a close-up of their emotionally battered mother.
Zoom in. Do you see it too?
What do you see when you look at her?
A woman desperately trying to save whatever she can salvage of her family, desperately trying to please her husband and do whatever it is that he wants her to do.
According to a Department of Justice survey, 1 in 4 American women experience domestic violence.
You know more what's going on at work than in your own house.
At the time of the tape, she was working, he was not. He was jealous of men on the outside.
And this got to do with somebody at work.
It does not. I don't have anyone.
Have a line in.
I can't tell you how many baseball coaches I was accused of, swimming teachers, karate teacher, other parents, anything.
Video this line ass him.
But her greatest agony was the role of her children. When you think your son was on the other side of that lens.
Not only that, my younger son was right there also.
He was in the room. Their youngest son, 8 years old.
Sit your stupid ass on.
June 22, 2003, terrifying images of physical abuse. The kind the experts say takes place every 15 seconds someplace in this country. The difference is, this is caught on video.
You don't know what to do. Look at your stupid ass. Look at the way you look.
Behind the camera, a 13-year-old boy watching his mother slapped, slugged, and throttled by his father.
You keep playing the game with him and knock your head across that wall.
At one point, for nearly 3 minutes, the son seems unable to record what the father is doing. He keeps the lens facing away toward his own feet.
You follow what I say to the T.
The terrified mother, Susan, covers her face while the father, Ulner, strangles her, throws her to the floor.
You have a stupid ass nerve about your stupid ass self. If you don't learn after I beat your ass all the time, you do not learn.
With the help of police over the next few hours, she ran a heart-pounding race against the clock. Since her husband patrolled every minute of her day, she had to get to the children before he did and before he made an irrational move. Officer Kathy Onions.
We decided to have Susan call the residence and speak to her husband to reassure him that she picked up the son as she was instructed to. We wanted to document what his response was to this conversation and, and have it on a tape.
Hello, honey.
Where are you?
I'm afraid to come home. I'm afraid to come home.
You stupid ass heifer. What you mean you're afraid to come home? You better bring my son home. If you don't bring my son home, I'm gonna kill you, heifer.
I don't want you to hurt me.
What
I'm afraid to come home.
In the end, Ulner is found guilty on all counts. The judge, who will never forget that searing tape, hands down a sentence of 36 years.
The videotape is it's terrible. And as you can see, it still gets to me.
So I know that may have been a lot to take in, but I did want to set the foundation for you to see that in this particular instance, although it was a husband and a wife, how the child was involved. And a lot of times what can happen is that the child can either internalize or externalize. And so If the child internalizes what they have witnessed, then they may start to produce low self-esteem. They may have feelings of sadness and anhedonia, lack of interest in pleasurable activities. They may experience suicidal ideation. They may even experience homicidal ideation. And so they really start to probably think that it's their fault. On the other hand, if the person externalizes, you would see them fighting more, acting out, and possibly even being perpetrators in adolescence. So I just want to take a moment to read this. I got flowers today. I got flowers today. It wasn't my birthday or any other special day. We had our first argument last night, and he said a lot of cruel things that really hurt me. I know he is sorry and didn't mean the things he said because he sent me flowers today. I got flowers today. It wasn't our anniversary or any other special day. Last night, he threw me into a wall and started to choke me. It seemed like a nightmare. I couldn't believe it was real. I woke up this morning sore and bruised all over. I know he must be sorry because he sent me flowers today. I got flowers today, and it wasn't Mother's Day or any other special day. Last night, he beat me up again, and it was much worse than all the other times. If I leave him, what will I do? How will I take care of my kids? What about money? I'm afraid of him and scared to leave, but I know he must be sorry because he sent me flowers today. I got flowers today. Today was a very special day. It was the day of my funeral. Last night, he finally killed me. He beat me to death. If only I had gathered enough courage and strength to leave him, I would have not gotten flowers today. And so I want to first highlight that the words can be interchanged. The pronouns can be interchanged. It can be a she as the perpetrator, which we're going to talk about in a second. But really driving home the point that when we talk about the cycle of violence and the calm and the loving and saying, I will never do it again, we need to also be mindful and educate those of the escalation. And so if you are a mental health clinician or a treating provider who works with adolescents, this would be a good intervention to use this poem to talk about, well, what does it look like in your relationship? He may not necessarily bring you flowers, but maybe your favorite candy, or say like, okay, I'll do your homework for you. And so what does it look like for them? But the same principle still applies. And so this could be a useful tool to facilitate that conversation. Just briefly want to go over this intimate partner violence myths quiz. The abuse usually ends when a survivor leaves an abusive relationship. Not true. Survivors are rarely sexually abused by the batterer. Not true. Many survivors are battered because of their substance abuse and or substance abuse by the batterer. Definitely not true. Relationship violence by adolescents, battering and date rape is a predictor of adult violence. Yes, that is true. Physicians, social workers, and other service providers are required by law to report suspected battering cases. Yes, we are mandated reporters, and because they are adolescents, we do have to report. Batterers who come from abusive families are more likely to be abusers than those from non-violent families. Now, there is research. So this one is a true, not true. And so it's mostly true because there's research that talks about, again, what I mentioned, the social learning theory, Patterson's aggression model. And so there is research where children who are exposed to violence are more likely to be abusers than those from non-violent family homes. However, just because a child has been exposed to violence, it does not automatically mean that they will be a perpetrator of abuse, but it does increase the chances. Those in homosexual relationships are equally likely to be in an abusive relationship as heterosexuals. Yes, that is true. Batterers rarely abuse their children. That is not true. There is a correlation, and a lot of research has talked about intimate partner violence and the correlation between child abuse but more specifically, child sexual abuse. And then battering can be life-threatening. That is very true. And survivors who injure or kill their abusers in self-defense are not likely to be prosecuted. Unfortunately, that is not true. There are many people, and there are court cases that I've worked on where the survivor still gets sentenced and sometimes has a harsh punishment for self-defense. And so this, I want to introduce the teen power and control wheel. And so you will notice that the teen power and control wheel is very similar to other power and control wheels, except looking at the various examples. One difference is the peer pressure, so threatening to expose someone's weakness or spread rumors, telling malicious lies about an individual to peer group, and then also using social status, so treating him or her like a servant, making all the decisions in the relationship, acting like the master of the castle, being the one to define men's and women's roles. And so again, if you are a clinician or a provider to adolescents, this is another great tool to use to facilitate that discussion to see if they have experienced anything on the power and control wheel. So now we're gonna watch this brief video.
Excuse me, what's the time?
Oh yeah, it's 3:12.
By the way,
Thank you.
Why are you talking to her?
I just asked what's time.
That's what you're not talking to other girls.
Please, you do something.
Always trying me.
I can't, bro. I asked her for the time, and you always playing, bro. You always doing too much. That's what I'm talking about, bro. Stop.
Stop talking to other girls. I'm the only one you need to talk to. None of y'all did. None of y'all
What I
did.
tell you about that?
What is wrong with you?
That's what I'm talking about. You always on me. You had a good time?
Oh shit, who is that?
My boy, I mean, I don't know. I think it's a random number.
Yeah, so.
You have fun?
Yeah.
Wait. Hold on. Are you serious right now?
You're my cousin.
Are you real serious right
You're my
now?
cousin.
I've never met this cousin before.
She's my cousin. She flew in.
Oh, she your cousin.
Yes.
She your cousin. I'm pretty sure I'm in all your family bugs. Don't me.
People looking. That's my cousin. That's my cousin. Please. Look at that. What's your face?
All right, so I just wanted to show that video so you can see what it could potentially look like and how, particularly with the cheating aspect and how it can lead to the emotional abuse. And so we've kind of already talked about this, so I just want to highlight a few: hypersensitivity, threatening and using violence, sense of entitlement, particularly if one person is an athlete, whether the star cheerleader or captain of the swim team or football team, etc., and the externalization of responsibility. And we've talked about the cycle of violence, or the cyclone of violence, rather, just because it can be so damaging, and understanding the victim's response versus the batter's behavior. And so the question that a lot of people have wondered: why do survivors return and stay? And so sometimes fear and love, and particularly what I've noticed in high school students or adolescents in general, if they come from a dysfunctional home, that relationship may be a source of safety for them, or they may view it as less harmful than what they experience in their own home. And so picking up what type of home the adolescent is involved in. But not to say there are some adolescents who come from very loving homes and they still are in very unhealthy, toxic, and abusive relationships. The hoping that the person will change, manipulation of abuser, lack of sufficient support system and basic needs. And so I know we don't have time, but I want you to just kind of think about some other reasons that individuals may stay. Now, substance use and IPV. I really wanted to talk about this because, unfortunately, particularly in California, with marijuana being legal, if you will, although still not for adolescents, you will see the intersection between substance use and intimate partner violence. Now, it is important to educate the perpetrator and the victim survivor that it's not the substance use that causes or is need to justify the aggression or the violence or the decisions that they make. However, substance use can exacerbate the situation. And so understanding how substances actually play a role in the relationship with the individuals, and how substances can lead to very unhealthy and poor decisions between the two. So really want to emphasize that substance abuse does not cause violence, period, whether it's alcohol, marijuana, etc. And yes, some people want to say, particularly with alcohol, or that it is more of a depressant, but it can bring out the worst in people, and marijuana chills people. But knowing that drugs have different effects on everybody's brains and bodies, and so it can do different things. And so really to just emphasize that while it does not cause violence or cause the person to act that way, it can exacerbate the situation. And so violence in teens: 1 in 3 adolescent girls in the US is a victim of physical, emotional, or verbal abuse from a dating partner. 1 in 5 tweens, that's ages 11 to 14, say their friends are victims of dating violence. And nearly half who are in relationships know friends who are verbally abused. And then 2 in 5 of the youngest tweens, so that's 11 to 12 years old, report that their friends are victims of verbal abuse in relationships. And so one thing I want to point out as we continue talking about teen dating violence in particular is the stalking. Now, with technology, which is something that was emphasized on the Teen Power and Control Will, nowadays people always say, drop me your location, send me a pin, or you can see on various social media platforms, such as, for example, Snapchat, where somebody is, particularly if they have their location setting on. This is very unsafe for a multitude of reasons, but also when you're looking at working with adolescents who are experiencing dating violence, that stalking is very prevalent and people use social media outlets to harass, threaten, and to cause fear. What I just touched on, pictures, videos, text chats, when adolescents say, hey, can you send me a picture? And then next thing you know, they try to use it as revenge porn. And so another way to manipulate the situation or to exert power and control over a situation. So now I want to talk to you about ideas about toxic masculinity.
We're going to murder those lousy Hun bastards by the bushel.
Never show weakness. The only pain that matters is the pain you inflict.
It's the roughest and toughest show on TV, the American Gladiators.
Got out tough people. When you get down there, it's man on man down there.
Police say boys aged 13 and 11 were arrested near the school carrying guns and wearing camouflage.
2 and 3 million American women are battered in their homes every year. More than 4,000.
Talking to herself, there's no one else who needs to know. She tells herself. Memories back when she was smooth and strong and waiting for the world to come along. So she knew it, now she's waiting for. She lies in faces in love with him, can't find a better man. She dreams in cause she dreams in him, can't find a better man. She lies in faces in love with him, can't find a better man. She dreams in cause she dreams in him, can't find a better man. Can't find a better man. Can't find a better man.
So I wanted to show this brief clip for 2 reasons. One, I encourage you all to go look at that to see the full media production. And then secondly, to start your wheels to turn of when boys look at older men or look at these video games, advertisements, movies, commercials, television shows, and all they see is the idea of violence and what masculinity is supposed to look like. How do you think that produces their thought processes, and how do you think that actually influences them and what they're supposed to view as what is masculine? And so some of the effects that masculine gender socialization informs how boys and men think of masculinity and therefore how they measure up as men. And so when we talk about this topic of toxic masculinity, such as boys shouldn't cry and boys shouldn't show emotion, that it really starts to put a weight on how one views themselves as a young boy or as a man. And so particularly, I wanted to touch on the topic of sexual abuse in relationships, because women can force themselves on men to have sex. Men, if they're in a homosexual relationship, can force themselves on their partner to have sex. It is something that happens. And so we don't want to negate that in romantic relationships, that one's ideology of what masculinity is supposed to look like based on the media or how they were raised that it does not wear and tear on them when it talks about if they should come forward or talk to their friends about what's going on in their relationships. And then again, the victim perpetrator cycle, knowing that a lot of times if a person was a victim growing up, there's a possibility that they can actually be a perpetrator as they get older. However, just because they were a victim of sexual abuse, it doesn't mean that they'll be a perpetrator of sexual abuse. Just because they were a victim of physical abuse, it doesn't mean that they will be a victim of physical abuse. Whatever they're a victim of, and however they may be a perpetrator, it does not have to be in the same category. And so battered men, the invisible victims, 1 in 7 men, and I believe that that is actually a number that's underreported, just like many of our numbers are underreported, but over the age of 18 will be the victim of severe physical violence by an intimate partner in his lifetime, may be more lethal in that to make up differences in strength, the female abuser may use weapons. I do have a short clip which is going to highlight that. And then male victims are highly underreported. And so we know, again, about the toxic masculinity that men are supposed to be seen as strong. They're supposed to be the providers. They're supposed to be the leaders. And therefore, they're not able to actually have a safe space to come forward and to speak about if their high school girlfriend always berates them or yells at them in front of their friends, or as we saw in that other video, hitting the person. And yes, just because the girl may or may not be not as strong physically in strength, it doesn't mean that that's not hurting that individual emotionally, even if it's not hurting them physically. And abusive men is treated as less serious or a joke. For example, sometimes people want to talk about certain cultures and having that crazy woman in their culture, and oh, like she always goes off on everybody and she always goes off on me, and trying to normalize the behavior. But emotional and psychological abuse are just as damaging as physical abuse. And honestly, a lot of research has showed that psychological abuse is even more damaging than physical abuse.
A new campaign is being launched today to raise awareness about male victims of domestic abuse. Tom Parmenter has been hearing one man's story.
In the mirror, Ian McNichol looks back at a man who was once broken, physically, mentally, and almost totally.
She was incredibly violent. I'll give you 3 or 4 examples. She placed lit cigarettes up my nostrils and forced me to go to sleep with those cigarettes still in my nose. She held my eyes open while she sprayed bleach into them. She assaulted me with a steam iron. She placed it on my left lower arm, on my upper right shoulder, and in the middle of my shoulder blades. She boiled a kettle and poured it over my groin. And then whilst I was stuck to a leather sofa writhing in agony, she reboiled that kettle and re-poured it over my groin. And I'd got to the point where I was so mentally ground down, I lost almost 25% of my body weight. I have 2 permanent indentations in my left shoulder where I was attacked with a hammer with such ferocity that the handle of the hammer actually broke.
His former partner is now serving 18 years in prison.
Her justification was that I didn't tell her often enough that I loved her, and I didn't instigate the physical side of the relationship. That was her justification for the violence, that I'd made her feel unattractive.
Ian is now slowly moving on with rebuilding his body and his life. He believes a tip-off to the police from an anonymous neighbour genuinely saved his life.
A lot of people will just not quite understand how it can happen, how you can't stand up to that kind of abuse.
Sure. Well, of course, as a victim, for me, it's a gender-neutral crime. What actually happens is that your feelings, I loved my partner, those feelings get abused. It's wrong for a man to hit a woman. Violence of any description is wrong, so it wouldn't have solved it. I can't say why she committed the level of violence that she did. But the fact is for men that the other additional difficulties that they may not be believed if they come forward. So there's a challenge there. But all victims should find the strength to confide in someone, because help is out there. I know that from my own experience and proof of that.
And as with any form of domestic abuse, deciding to find that help is often the hardest step. Tom Parmenter, Sky News.
And so this video just highlights everything that we've already discussed in terms of that women can use more lethal forms, and as to reasons why men will not necessarily come forward. And so we already know that it is a myth that men cannot experience IPV, and only gay and weak men experience IPV, and that is also a myth. And so just to kind of wrap up on what is a healthy relationship is equality. Equality of intimacy, non-threatening behavior, trust and support, respect, honesty and accountability, independence, shared responsibility, negotiation, and fairness. And so when we talk about whether it's romantic or platonic, a healthy relationship looks like where no one is using foul language, calling the person out of their name, making the person feel unsafe. The person feels that they can go out and have a life with their partner as well as a life without their partner, and there is trust and honesty in that relationship. And so this is another tool that I like to use when talking about what does it look like to be in a safe and healthy relationship. And lastly, the Dating Bill of Rights, and going over that everyone has the right to trust themselves and their instincts, be respected as a person, change their mind, express their feelings, refuse a date so they don't have to feel obligated to go out with somebody, and not be physically, emotionally, or sexually abused. So what can you do to help? Approach the conversation with understanding and making safety the objective. Don't pass judgment. Understand the victim survivor may not be ready to leave. However, still have a safety plan and seek resources for the steps they are ready to take. And if seeking shelter, prepare them for what may be tedious, an all-day process. Encourage them to keep trying. And then here are some other aspects to use and that you can make them aware of. Here are some resources. I encourage everyone to have the National Domestic Violence Hotline number, because these are areas that are local to San Diego and LA County, but the National Domestic Violence Hotline can give you more resources that might be pertinent to your particular county. And so I encourage you to send any questions that you may have, any comments, and this is my contact information. Thank you so much, and I hope you all learned something today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rogers, for giving that presentation, and thank you to all the participants for joining.
Excellent. Thank you so much.